The Task of the Moralist by Richard Gula. For some years now, when I have been teaching this course, I have started the course out by using an article by Richard Gula called The Task of the Moralist. The Task of the Moralist is an excellent way for starting this course, and it's excellent because it covers essentially what we are hoping for you to become as a consequence of taking this course. It asks the question, what actually is a moralist? And in order to get at this question, I think it's important, first of all, to try to divorce ourselves from preconceived notions as to what a moralist is. I know that sometimes people think of moralist in kind of a negative way. They think of a moralist as perhaps somebody who is self-righteous or somebody who is going to be judging other people, who is so rooted in a kind of moralism that they really can't see the forest through the trees. They don't really listen to other people. They just have such strong convictions about what's right and wrong, and they almost try to jam that down other people's throat. As you can see in the article, The Task of the Moralist, this is not at all what a true moralist actually does. If you'll notice on the slide that you should now be able to see, the task of the moralist, according to Richard Gula there, is first and foremost to do moral analysis. Now think about that word analysis for a moment, because that's a very important word, and it's often a misunderstood word. The word analysis comes from its Greek roots, ana and luein, which literally mean to tear apart or to somehow separate. So if you think about the task of the moralist as first and foremost as someone who has the ability to analyze situations, to analyze different moral and ethical dilemma, that person first and foremost is able to kind of see all of the different component parts of a given situation. In other words, they're able to break things down into an understanding as to what are the values that are at play, what are some of the potential consequences, what, first and foremost, even before that, are all of the different things that we need to know in order to be able to make a sound moral judgment. You'll notice the bullet point right below that says that when we do moral analysis, the quest is not to know all the answers. In many instances, it's impossible to know all the answers. I think one of the things that you will find out in this course is that when we're looking at medical situations, sometimes the answers are pretty clear, but many, many times the answers are not. Many times the answers require of us to pay attention to what is happening in the situation. What are all the potential outcomes? Where are the uncertainties to which we must attend? The second bullet point there says that the task of the moralist, really what we expect of a good moralist, is someone who is able to help wade through the opacity of moral issues. Now think about that statement for a moment. When you wade through something, wading through something is not always walking very easily through things. When we wade through something, we're kind of wading through terrain in which we don't always see the ground. Notice that word opacity. We want to wade through the opacity of moral issues. What that is to say is that some moral issues are not entirely clear. The word opacity has to do with a certain kind of obscuring of certain matters. So we need to recognize that the task of the moralist, at least according to Richard Gula, is not to know all the answers, but instead to be somebody who can wade through a kind of terrain in which not all the answers and not even all the facts are immediately clear. You can see the bullet point beneath that says that the conclusions are not always clear. Sometimes we would like to believe that we know exactly what is right and wrong and that we can apply that in all instances. Unfortunately, when we come across very complicated situations in which there are so many different competing values and different claims, we need to recognize that those conclusions will not always be clear. So he proposes that the good moralist, when he or she is wading through the opacity of moral issues, essentially serving as a resource to others to help make good decisions, that person needs to have 3 ingredients. You'll notice that the 3 ingredients that he identifies are the ingredients of sensitivity, reflection, and method. I would invite you to think about his notion of ingredients very much in the same way as you would think about ingredients when you are baking something. If you are going to make a loaf of bread, think about all the different things that you need to have in order to make a good loaf of bread. To make a good loaf of bread, obviously you need flour. You also probably need water. You also probably need eggs. And perhaps if you're getting really fancy, you also add in some kind of herbs or whatever. So anyways, you have to have all of these different things in order to be able to make a good loaf of bread. Without any of these things, without, for example, the flour or the eggs or the water, you are not going to have a good loaf of bread. Well, according to Richard Gula, if you're going to be a good moralist, you have to have 3 ingredients. He says that these ingredients include sensitivity, reflection, and method. The next thing that I want to do is I want to describe what he means by each of these 3 ingredients and why they're so important. The first ingredient that Richard Gula describes that we need for a good moralist is the ingredient of sensitivity. You'll notice that he states that sensitivity has to do with living from the heart. Now, this is oftentimes misunderstood, and the reason why it's misunderstood is that people believe that perhaps if he's going to talk about moral living beginning in the heart, that would seem to suggest that morality is all about emotion. That is not true. That is not at all in line actually with Richard Gula's overall picture of what makes for a good moralist. Rather, what Richard Gula wants to focus on is the fact that one of the things that makes for a very good moralist is that person recognizes the dignity, the sacredness of every human life. And he states that we are not actually able to reason to that. In other words, that's something that we understand because our hearts are attuned to this reality around us. He even states that we recognize, when we recognize the role of sensitivity, that moral value exists for the sake of discerning what best befits people, and not the other way around. Sometimes you may have encountered situations where people have a moral code, and the moral code seems almost so unrealistic, perhaps so stringent, that it seems to put undue burdens on people. It seems actually to become perhaps even somewhat of an oppressive force. He wants to state that moral value actually exists for the sake of discerning what best befits people, which, by the way, is very consistent with natural law theory that has to do with how do we best bring about human flourishing through all of our actions. Rather than morality being conceived as simply something that restricts people, and sometimes it does do that, morality ought to be conceived as something that frees people up, that helps people to live their most true, authentic selves with true freedom, and therefore to flourish. Contrary to the notion that we should simply let our hearts guide all of our actions, you can see that in his article, and on this slide, he affirms the role of integration, and that is to say that he says that paying attention to one's heart in moral decisions, being truly sensitive to the needs, cares, concerns of other people, is not just all about living from that emotional level of ourselves, but it's integrating that with our full selves. So in other words, bringing our intellectual abilities to bear on important questions. You can think about situations where people, perhaps with the best of intentions, have done things that ultimately became very insensitive. They actually became very destructive. They actually did not respect the true sacredness of every human individual. There is a great quote that says, "The mind instructs emotion, and emotion tutors reason." If you think about it, when we're living from our heart, we are propelled to want to do good for other people. But we can't do good for other people unless we use our intellectual abilities to do good things, to practically realize our goal of doing good for other people. Minus intellectual ability, minus running claims through our minds, we can end up doing some very terrible things. The next ingredient for us to consider, that is, an ingredient that makes for a good moralist, is that of reflection. You'll notice from the article, Richard Gula looks at reflection as being very important because reflection is essentially our stepping back from the complexities of situations and asking some essential questions. One of those questions is, how do we know what reality truly is? Sometimes we think we know everything that's going on and that we have a certain degree of certainty as to everything that is happening around us. But when we really stop to think about it, we realize that there are some things that perhaps we are missing. Some things that perhaps because our perception is so biased, we are not actually paying attention to, or we are not actually taking in. And so we have to understand that sometimes our perceptions can be rather distorted, and with distorted perceptions come distorted conclusions. So part of reflection is taking that step back and asking that essential question, how do we know what reality is? Are we truly trying the best we can to understand the reality that is so important to understand in order to make good decisions? The second question, what can we know and what can we not know? There are many, many things that we can know, and those are important for us to be able to ask questions to get at those matters. But there are also things that we cannot know. We ought not to assume, for example, other people's intention, because we don't always understand the intention of other people. We ought not even to assume, heck, our own intentions. We have to ask that third question there. How reliable is our knowledge? Is our knowledge based on hearsay? Is our knowledge based on, again, our very biased perceptions? Or does our knowledge come from asking essential questions, from truly listening, from thinking them through, from taking a step back so that we can see perhaps the larger picture in things? And then finally, we have to ask ourselves that fourth question, what are some ways that can help us to know reality as completely as possible? I mentioned asking essential questions, but maybe sometimes it's a matter of our being quiet so that we can truly listen, truly attend to all that is happening around us, to all of the different facts that we need to be aware of. Some other concepts that Richard Gula weaves into his treatment of this whole notion of reflection has to do with the distinction between relativism versus absolutism. These are terms that we will continue to use throughout the course, and they're rather important to be familiar with. Relativism, which is also known as such things as emotivism and ethical relativism, really essentially means that there is no right or wrong, but human thinking, or in the case of emotivism, human feeling, that makes it so. Let me repeat that. There is no right or wrong, but human thinking, or human feeling, that makes it so. That means that it all depends on where you stand. There is no such thing as right or wrong in an objective sense. All of morality becomes incredibly subjective. What's right for you is right for you, but that may not be right for me. There are some very, very serious problems with relativism. First of all, it is self-refuting. If I say there is no such thing as right, and I am right, I have just created a logical contradiction that would really kind of mess up my mind if I continued to believe that way. So we have to believe that there are some things that are objective in nature, some things that all of us can point to, and that all of us hopefully can give persuasive arguments about and come to agreement about, that are objectively true and objectively right or objectively wrong. The other side of that, kind of the other end of a continuum from, let's say, a militant form of relativism, would be a form of absolutism, which also gets called sometimes physicalism. Absolutism says that there are certain standards for right and wrong. They apply the same exact way in every situation. And so it doesn't take into account the complexities of situations. It doesn't take into account intentions of agents, that is, of people who are in the situation. It just looks at the physical structure of the actions that are happening. And it says if that action is wrong, for example, let's say stealing, if somebody is taking something that does not belong to them, then it is always wrong. It doesn't matter if they're doing it because they absolutely have to in order to be able to feed their family, let's say. It doesn't matter. It's still objectively wrong. So you can see those two different concepts, relativism, absolutism, they are two different sides of a continuum, and in some sense, neither of them is very adequate for a full, kind of more sophisticated type of morality or ability to be a moralist. Part of our reflection also leads us, according to Richard Gula, to consider our own experiences and the extent to which it is important to experience all that which is around us in order fully to understand reality. He introduces Lonergan's cognitional theory. And you'll notice on the slide that is now showing that Lonergan's cognitional theory actually has three different, almost like, let's say, sub-ingredients in our article. That is, that Lonergan believed that we need three different things in order truly to come to deep understanding. He said we need, first of all, this experience that I was referring to. We need to stop. We need to attend. We need to ask the essential questions. We need to recognize how perhaps our own biased perceptions can get in the way of our really being open to what is actually in fact happening around us. The second thing there that he talks about is understanding, which is very similar to what we just described as reflection. So that is taking that step back. It's pondering. It's thinking about, it's contemplating. The third item there, as you can see, is judgment. And judgment is where we take some kind of moral matter and we don't just say, okay, well, I've experienced all I can, but I am morally neutral. After all, in many situations, we cannot be morally neutral. It's virtually impossible. To be morally neutral is, in some instances, already to have made a decision. And after we experience and after we reflect on how various values come into play, what our goals are in a given situation, we must arrive at judgment. We must arrive at conviction. We must know where we stand and why we stand there. So those are all components of this whole piece of reflection, and how Lonergan's cognitional theory can help us to understand, perhaps in a deeper way, what this reflection piece is all about. The final ingredient in our moralist batter is that of method. And you'll notice that Richard Gula states that there are three different types of methods that can be used in moral decision-making. They are the teleological methods, deontological method, and the responsibility method, which is something that is a bit more contemporary. The teleological method, if you'll notice, actually has three different subsets, if you will, that is, three different distinctive methods that all share one thing in common, and that is they all share that they are oriented towards a goal. In natural law ethics, the goal is to promote human flourishing. The goal is to protect intrinsic goods such as life, knowledge, orderly social life, and family life. In virtue ethics, the goal is to, as you can see from the title, to promote virtue, and it states that virtue is something that we must cultivate through our habits, that is, through the different actions that we perpetually, consistently do. And then finally, there is utilitarianism that states that the goal of our actions should be to promote the most happiness for the most number of people. The deontological method is not goal-oriented. As a matter of fact, it's not goal-oriented at all. Instead, it looks at what is it that is our duty. What is it that is our moral obligation, come what may, whatever the situation happens to be, what is it that we must do? So you can think, for example, in a healthcare environment, the duty of a doctor or a nurse is to be truthful with patients, and they ought never not to be truthful with patients. There are some exceptions that we'll look at, but for the most part, their duty, after all, they take an oath, actually, that requires of them always to act in the best interests of patients, and part of that is always to be honest. And then finally, the third method of moral decision-making is responsibility, and that is oriented towards considering how is it that we care for one another. The responsibility model actually comes from a feminist critique of ethics that says that the previous models of ethics don't take into consideration something that's very, very essential in our human relationships, and that is that in our human relationships, when rightly considered, they must promote care for one another. And how is it best that we do that becomes the essential question. During our course, we're going to be talking a great deal more about these ethical theories. You can expect to, by the end of the course, be using words such as teleology and deontology and care-based theory with some regularity. This concludes the lecture about Richard Gula's article, The Task of the Moralist.